value stream mapping, that's a verb. That's an activity. It is an activity of moving from an unmapped space to a mapped space, a space in which there's something that could be mapped. There's the potential to get clarity on this, but it is invisible until you take the time to actually record what's going on that moves what is unconscious to being conscious and being collectively conscious, especially with these artifacts of a map. Hi, I'm Andrew Davis.
And I'm Steve Pereira. And this is the Value Stream Show.
Welcome back to another episode of the Value Stream Show. Today we're going to talk about value stream mapping. So one of these, we're in these early episodes, we're making sure that we cover all the fundamentals. And so if you've not listened to the previous episodes on what is value and so forth, definitely go back and check those out. So Steve, help us understand, what is value stream mapping? What's its function and so forth?
So I actually learned about value stream mapping before I really understood the context for any of this. My first exposure to value stream mapping was actually in business school, which I briefly wandered into for a time, and before I realized that I didn't have the patience. But they covered value stream mapping in a manufacturing context. So we're learning about things like supply chain and fundamentals of business, and essentially looking at how does the business work? How do we think about what is happening in the business? And value stream mapping is kind of this technique for visualizing and measuring a value stream in a kind of ad hoc, on-demand way. So the act of mapping a value stream is drawing out the activities that occur across a value stream. And traditionally that goes from kind of raw materials or suppliers to customers. And the origin of it is kind of through manufacturing. It originated in auto manufacturing officially, but its original birthplace was this area of study called time and motion, which is from the early 20th century, where people were looking at manufacturing all kinds of things and understanding how do we know that this is working and that we're focusing on improving it in the right places. So they looked at, okay, what's happening? How long is everything taking? What should we derive from what's happening in order to understand what to do about getting to a better state? And so I sort of backed into value stream mapping as a technical leader in a growing organization, trying to understand what is taking us so long. Because, over time, things slow down, things get more and more complicated. It's very difficult for individuals to understand where to contribute, how to contribute, and where to focus. And so answering the question, what's happening and where should we be focusing our efforts, brought me back to value stream mapping. And I actually didn't revisit the term until about 6 months to a year after doing it from, just sort of intuitively trying to answer that question. And then looking at, okay, there's got to be a better way of doing this than the way that I'm stumbling through it, and finding value stream mapping as the official practice that has been kind of pursuing this capability of mapping out value streams and understanding what's happening. And there's a lot of detail out there, but that's my history with it and how I kind of encountered value stream mapping in my own experience. And then, of course, I fell in love with it because it really made a massive difference in the level of clarity and understanding personally for me. So understanding what's going on and where we should focus, but also leading a group of individual contributors. It really provided a level of visibility for them that they didn't have before, working as individuals on areas of this value stream without visibility into the whole end-to-end flow. And then also working with peers. So I would have to collaborate with folks across the organization who also didn't have visibility into what was happening in engineering or product development and delivery. And also it became a way of communicating up to the CEO and other executives and the board in some cases to demonstrate, here's where we are right now. Here's where we're going to focus based on this data that we've collected. And I think is what's happening in the flow of work so that you can make really high quality decisions.
Fantastic. I super briefly, just to put my angle on it, I really just encountered the term a few years ago as I was getting deeper into the DevOps world. I moved from just trying to ease and automate the Salesforce development lifecycle to realizing there was this whole community about DevOps. And I have to thank Jez Humble for his book, a series of talks he did, especially also the book Lean Enterprise, which I loved, in which he put a lot of energy into advocating for value stream mapping. It's also in the DevOps handbook. And really, as I started to pull the threads on that, then began to realize what a massive and important area this is. And if I can go back and take another sweeping pass through the history to help the listeners to fill out their understanding. So Steve mentioned these time and motion studies, and this is early 20th century, say around the time of Henry Ford beginning to, create his assembly lines. There's a guy who gets often cited, Frederick Winslow Taylor. Did I get his name right? Frederick Winslow Taylor? I think that's right, but I'll get my fact checker, Steve, working in parallel.
I think that's probably right. We'll check our facts and update show notes.
So Taylor, and then there was another couple that was very involved in time and motion studies, and we're going to have to beg forgetfulness and put names in the show notes. But there's a couple who did a lot of research in these time and motion studies. Now, what's interesting is value stream mapping, I think, falls into this really interesting area that's tricky for us psychologically to understand, because from one point of view, if you map something out and describe it, it becomes blindingly obvious, and everybody's like, oh yeah, sure, I knew that. Right? But if you haven't mapped it out, in the absence of that clearly expressed and stated picture and overview of what's happening, the time and motion and change and process and so forth, we don't really see it. And we act really as if we weren't seeing the bigger picture. And it's very easy for us to not act in optimal ways unless we've brought this level of visibility. So lingering on this time and motion studies, right? These researchers would just watch workers as they're moving, doing their job, and, with a stopwatch and so forth, and say, how long did they take to do this? And, oh, here they're moving across to get these pieces, and they're bringing it back to their place. And now they have to go and get their hammer, right? And they bring it back to their workspace. And then they have to walk their item over to the next person at the table, right? When you begin to look at this, you begin to see, well, half of the time or 3/4 of the time or more that person spend working, they're actually spending doing things like moving around to another workstation or to go get a tool or waiting for somebody else. And so you begin to expose this picture that you can only see when you make a map across time. And the interesting thing about time is that it keeps disappearing, right? Every moment the past disappears and you can no longer see it. Even though from one point of view, our memory is tracking things, our memory is very, very unreliable. Just ask any, judge and prosecutor. Witnesses' memories are very unreliable. Our memories are very, very unreliable. So time and motion studies then set the foundation. Toyota in particular were the ones that took some of the early learning by Henry Ford and adapted it to the unique needs of their time in the late 1940s, 50s, rebuilding the Japanese economy, where I think we can't overstate the psychological power of this group of people coming together and saying, listen, we are the ones who Japan needs to rebuild our economy, enable mobility and transportation at an affordable price with available materials for Japanese buyers so that we can rebuild our country and be a player on the world. Because there's a lot of national pride in Japan, rightly so. They have an amazing culture. And they really felt like we deserve a place in this world stage. It is incumbent upon us to work together to figure out. So they took Henry Ford's manufacturing process, but then they optimized it because they didn't have the ability to buy a whole lot of materials and have them sitting around. So they basically could only buy enough materials for the one car order that came in. So they had this constraint that required them to move towards a hyper efficiency of single piece flow. The idea that you get a customer order, then you get the parts together that you need to assemble the order, and you assemble the automobile. Now, in that process, they created a diagram called material and information flows. And that was really the original name of value stream maps, were material and information flows, part of the Toyota production system. But I really love that name and those original diagrams because it's two things. It's material and information that's flowing. And I think we still struggle to reconcile that there are these two parallel activities. And in manufacturing, of course, you have actual physical materials that are going through a manufacturing process. But critically, there's information. Each individual worker has information on, how finished is the part, how many new parts are needed. They have to update maybe other workers on the status of things. And just like because time passes on, moves on, moment by moment, all of these, the history of what actually happened even a few minutes ago gets forgotten and lost. You're dealing with something that's fundamentally invisible. Now, fast forward to, for example, the world of knowledge work and the world of software development. Everything that we're working on is invisible. And the idea of making a map is such an interesting analogy because here, this session, we're talking about value stream mapping. Value stream mapping, that's a verb. That's an activity. It is an activity of moving from an unmapped space to a mapped space, a space in which there's something that could be mapped. There's the potential to get clarity on this, but it is invisible until you take the time to actually record what's going on. And it's a kind of reflection. It's a kind of looking back and contemplating, what is this workflow? What's this process? How are we working together? What am I doing that moves what is unconscious to being conscious and being collectively conscious, especially with these artifacts of a map, of an actual diagram. Now, Steve and I often say the mapping is more important than the map, because the map, this final artifact, doesn't reflect the process of making this stuff conscious. What you're doing effectively is you're loading up the consciousness of these participants with a picture of their collective work process by building it out together. And the artifact basically helps to stabilize their memory. But what you've built is you've built a collective conscious awareness of the work process so that people can begin to look at it and consciously improve it. So we've been talking about enabling development teams to have greater impact on their business. So I want to pause briefly to talk about the next generation of development teams and to thank our sponsor, Copado. Copado's focus is on bringing the power of DevOps to low-code platforms such as Salesforce, ServiceNow, and SAP. The world of development is changing fast. And a lot of the IT innovation happening in our organizations now is being done on these low-code platforms and being done by people who may not have a traditional software development background. So the challenge is that these systems are becoming incredibly complex. So low-code development may be easy to begin with and easier to get started with, but when you're dealing with dozens or even hundreds of contributors working over the course of months and years, you pretty quickly reach a scale where you need things like version control, automated deployments, automated testing, and value stream management. So that's where Copado helps as the leading DevOps and testing platform for low-code. So if you're managing a platform like Salesforce, ServiceNow, or SAP, check them out at copado.com, get a demo, and find tons of other resources. Now back to our show.
I think another really valuable aspect of that mapping being more important than the map is that the process of mapping actually generates a ton of conversation that doesn't happen otherwise, right? If you're not trying to make a map, you don't ask questions about like, is that really how this works? Or, I thought this took a lot less time than, I'm hearing. Or, your understanding of this area of the value stream is very different than, my understanding. Or, why does it take so long to do this thing? Or why are we doing this in that order? Or why do we do these things in parallel? Why do we have this? Why is this a meeting instead of just a a document or a message in Slack, or why is this an email? What's involved in this part of the value stream where we go off and we have to ask this other group to do something and then come back to us. That act of reconciling the understanding, the collective understanding of what's happening is super valuable. But I think that another part that's really important to emphasize here is that a lot of folks don't understand the difference between a value stream map and any other kind of diagram or representation. And to me, there's a very, if you take kind of a flow chart or a process diagram, and a lot of folks are kind of familiar with process diagrams where you've got swim lanes for all the participants, and it's kind of tracking what happens across different roles. So, it starts with maybe a product owner, and then it goes to developer and they do their piece, and then it goes to QA, and then it goes to a release manager. And you're sort of seeing the work flow across different individuals. What's missing from that is this aspect of measurement and reflecting an understanding of reality. Whereas, process is very much kind of like, this is how things should happen, or this is our understanding of what's happening. But a value stream map really gets you to what has happened based on data and representing the flow of material and information in a context of, this is how long it really takes. And in practice, what that means is that it kind of it nudges folks or moves folks into an activity of trying to understand retroactively, how long does that really take? What is really involved in this process? And so when we map a value stream, we're usually asking, think of either the last release that you did, so the last flow across the value stream, and let's try and understand how long that all took, what were the activities involved, how often the work got kind of thrown back because it was incomplete or it wasn't to a specification. There's all kinds of different dimensions you can represent on a value stream. But primarily, you've got activities and then the timing of how long each of those activities took, and then the delay between those activities. And that gets you a lot of value. Also layer on things like value added time, quality measurements, work that was complete and accurate at each stage, so that you have an estimation of, by the time you get to a customer, what are the odds that they're going to get what. And we can link to in the show notes a lot more depth around what are value streams from a technical perspective. But I think, in this episode, mapping from your perspective, or what would be valuable to you, because I know we could talk about value stream mapping versus event storming or versus process that gets generated as part of trying to understand a value stream. And that's essentially what I think we're getting.
One of the points that you made just there triggered a thought in me. You said when you're doing value stream mapping as an activity, collective activity, what you're doing is you're generating valuable information. So in our last episode, we talked about value. We talked about the inputs that go into creating something, which of course have value. The most valuable of all of those inputs is time, right? And that's why we want to save time in processes whenever we can, or typically the most valuable is time. But and then outputs. And so a value stream, of course, is taking certain raw outputs, including time and energy and other resources, creating an output that is valuable. But the value stream mapping activity as well, the inputs into that are participants who have partial knowledge and some memory of that system, right? And then they spend a bit of time mapping the value stream together, put a little bit of energy, a little bit of communication, create artifacts together. But the output of a value stream mapping session is valuable information. It is a value stream map is the physical artifact, but the physical artifact is not as important as the collective clarity that has been produced. So in the last episode, we talked about value and how there's the value for individual contributors, the value for an organization, the value for the customer, and that you have to reconcile all of these. But even within a team, you have to reconcile the values of the different contributors in the team. You and I, pretty quickly in our conversations, we came to these three key elements of action: value, clarity, and flow. So last episode we talked about what is value. This episode we're talking about clarity. Clarity is the ability to distinguish, for example, this from that, to know, for example, like Steve mentioned, this confusion. Hey, I thought that process was quick and easy. Why does it appear to be taking half a day every time we do it, right? That's increasing collective clarity on whether something is short or long. And that's the part of our mind you could think, that's thought, right? It's the ability to tell this from that. And that is one of the valuable outputs from this, because when we're talking about knowledge work, we are doing work to generate new knowledge. And the value stream mapping is a very powerful, very focused kind of knowledge work, where you bring a group of people together, pool their collective understanding, also go and see what's actually happening in the workspace, or measure things if you have ways to automate and track work. And you're generating new knowledge, and that is new and valuable knowledge. And it's valuable because you can take that knowledge and go back to making all of these various process improvements. One of the main outputs from a value stream mapping session is beginning to identify where are there really unnecessary inefficiencies. More people doing something that are needed, fewer people doing something that are needed, too much waiting time. You begin to adjust your work process. And I guess my last point on this is that what happens if you don't do value stream mapping? I'll take my shot, and I'd love to hear your take. What happens if you don't do value stream mapping? I think our default behavior is just to look busy, right? We work and we kind of show up and we do all our work and we keep our boss happy. Keeping our boss happy is one key thing. Working an 8-hour day, that feels like it's fair, working overtime. But all of those things are looking at costs, right? They're optimizing everything around costs. Have I put in a fair amount of time and so forth, as opposed to thinking in terms of value? Steve, what would you say what happens if you don't do value stream mapping?
I like that question. I think, you really characterized it well. The thing that I think about is what you get without value stream mapping, without this go and see or measurement, is that you have the status quo plus entropy, right? You have the status quo plus like a steady degrade of performance that's introduced by increased complexity, time, all these things sort of piling up that don't get cleaned out on a regular basis, right? They just sort of like accumulate naturally. And so value stream mapping gives you the opportunity to kind of step out of your current state and look at what can we actually do to achieve a higher level of performance. And without that, I see very few mechanisms. I certainly do, I've never seen a method or a practice that's as effective as value stream mapping for that purpose of stepping back and looking at what's happening so that we can break out of the status quo and get ourselves closer to a future state of higher performance.
So this, housekeeping, getting the clarity on what's actually happening, seeing what's going on, so that one of the first things you notice when you see something, if you see something for the first time, one of the first things you notice is it's a bit of a mess, right? So sometimes at Copado, we talk about the importance of establishing visibility first. Visibility leads to quality of process and so forth. And why? Because once you can see something, you naturally identify the quality issues and can begin to work to address it. And quality is the foundation for speed. If you really want to move fast, you have to be looking at the quality of your process, the quality of your communication, the quality of your workflow. I guess to end maybe on your housekeeping analogy, Steve, I guess that fed into why your LinkedIn profile calls you the Marie Kondo. What was the phrase? The Marie Kondo of workflows.
The Marie Kondo of automation.
The housekeeping and of automation. I love it. It looks like maybe you retired that part of your profile, but that was your old profile. Steve Pereira is the Marie Kondo of automation, cleaning up teams' processes.
With that, I think we're out of time for today, but I'm sure we'll be coming back to value stream mapping as a practice, the theory behind it, and how folks can really start to adopt it as a practice in their organizations. So thanks everybody for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for joining us. Please rate, review, and share the podcast. And make sure to visit us at valuestreamshow.com to sign up for our newsletter and find show notes, episodes, and more.